Hi, I'm Sonia Luna, CEO and founder of Aviva Spectrum. My guest today is the Global Director of Internal Audit at Quiksilver, Nicole Ungaro. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy you're a guest today because I know we're going to get really deep into a very serious issue. It's an increasing trend, which is talking about auditing third-party providers. Okay, so let's get into it. What are some of the best practices you can suggest for auditing third-party providers? And more importantly, what are some of the common mistakes?
Yes, of course. Let's start with some of the best practices. I think it's really important that management gets internal audit really involved in the planning phase when deciding to outsource a third party. You know, sometimes some of those third parties don't have a SOC report that's available, and it's really important that internal audit understands how they can help and how they can get involved. When I was at one of my former companies, I helped update one of our contract policy processes to really make sure that we include some of the due diligence required prior to sign off and to make sure that internal audit was notified when a third party would be used. Therefore, instead of before they were engaged, we can kind of step up and say, hey, what are the controls that are going to be in place at this third party if in doubt there was not a SOC report? You know, we're not always lucky to have some of those big ADP companies that have SOC reports because they have so many clients. You know, SOC reports can be very expensive. Some of the Amazons of the world, they are not going to provide a SOC report. So it's really important to get internal audit involved, properly vet some of your third-party providers before engaging them. And, you know, sometimes I find it kind of strange that internal audit is really supposed to be managing and monitoring risk and help with enterprise risk assessment, but they're not always the ones at the table when you have these important meetings, and they are not really always aware of some of the changes that are happening in the organization. And I was really lucky at one of my former companies. I actually reported to the CEO, and I was able to really be a part of strategy and be able to know where the company was going and kind of when they decided to do some of those outsourcing.
And so it sounds like communication and coming up with a collaborative approach on doing that upfront work on the relationship with that service provider, right? So,
Definitely.
You know, what's the criteria? What's the performance evaluation process? So right before we get into, you know, outsourcing, obviously the why factor, but more importantly, like what exactly are we going to get out of the relationship as it's being performed? And what are those triggering events to say this is on track and this is not on track? Because you're right, not everybody's going to have the financial backing of creating a SOC report to provide internal audit or the management team.
Exactly. And, you know, and one of the second points I wanted to bring up is just making sure that, you know, the internal auditor and legal kind of look through the contract and make sure that internal audit has the right to actually audit at that location and making sure that, you know, the processes and procedures that everyone agreed upon actually were implemented. You know, I really feel like internal audit can audit any process as long as they understand what the procedures are, but they have to actually be there and the evidence has to be available. I think it's important to maybe also have the right to have surprise audits, not always, you know, let them know when you're coming so you can really get a sense and a flavor of what's happening there and to really protect the company and the risks that might be involved. And
possibly working with counsel on what's an emergency audit, right? Like,
yes.
Like you said, it may not have to be scheduled so many days, months, or weeks in advance, but what would be a triggering event that would cause the management team to say, no, we need to be there tomorrow?
Exactly. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, you know, when all else fails, make sure that you really have strong business controls in your organization. So that way, if anything goes awry at your service provider, that you've been able to detect it. You don't want any material misstatements in your financial statements, and especially if you don't have that SOC report that's going to help you identify certain errors or exceptions, you want to make sure that, you know, management is also aware. And a lot of misnomers is, you know, outsourcing kind of means out of scope, and that's not always the case.
Right, it could be in scope. There's a lot of ways of determining that, scoping process in terms of not only materiality but also substance of, let's say, risk. Sometimes you thought you could allocate some of that risk off to someone when in reality it's actually you still own the risk. What are some of the common mistakes then that you see?
Yes, I was going to bring up, I had a story from a colleague they shared with me, and unfortunately they decided to outsource their distribution center. There was a lot of misnomers, miscommunication between the service provider and management. When they went out there to perform the audit, they found out that the SOX procedures were not being continued, and it was basically their WMS system. And that numbers, those kind of bring revenue and inventory to the financial statements. And it's kind of beyond me how people can kind of let that slide and kind of determine that, that's not in scope, because those are two major numbers. So they had some issues. They did not have control reliance on the system for most of the year. So that was a big disconnect between the contract and the processes and the procedures out at the distribution center. I think that the third party kind of thought, well, they're not a public company. They don't have to comply with SOX. It's expensive. And internal audit went out there a little bit too late. And so at this point, it caused a lot of extra work for internal audit, external audit, and then finally the third party had to hire another individual, which increased the cost. A lot of times people feel, we're going to outsource this because we want to save money. But if you don't have the right processes and procedures in place, at the end of the day, it can be very expensive, especially if you have non-control reliance.
Yeah, we've even seen common mistakes such as, like you said, validating the expectations in the contract, right? So people respect what you inspect, and if you're not already in the beginning of the relationship, not validating certain key reports that you're relying upon, whether it's services or goods, what have you, that you're allowing this third-party provider to do for you, if you don't do it in the beginning, sometimes people feel like, oh, well, I guess they don't really need a lot of this detail, or, gee, we never get questions on this, or no one ever comes out here.
Exactly.
And so there's a psychological effect that happens to some third-party providers, obviously, that don't get audited on a regular basis by a third party. But what would you say, though? I mean, kind of shifting, viewpoints. Okay, so a chief audit executive, right? So they have the SOC report, let's say. So what should a chief audit executive have as a top priority when they're reviewing a SOC report, which is also known as a Service Organization Controls Report?
Well, I think it's really important that they look at the client considerations that are included in that report, because those are really the controls that need to be in place at the organization, right? And I think it's important that management understands that a SOC report isn't really an internal audit report. It's not, at the end of the day, something that internal audit needs necessarily, because we can perform other procedures, but it's really to give management that sense that everything's okay, that they can rely on what the service organization is doing. They should really hone in on any of the deficiencies that might be identified and determine if there's any other work that might need to be done. Another thing that's really important is making sure that the SOC report covers the right period. A lot of the retail organizations that I've worked at are January 31 year end, and sometimes the report, stops at 12/31, and then there's a time where the report needs to be issued, and then there's a gap. So what I've found is, sometimes you need to visit those locations, try to do procedures up front in order to make sure things are okay before you get that SOC report.
This has been a fascinating interview, Nicole, and I'm confident our listeners gained a lot of value, especially about the risks involved with third-party providers. Thank you so much for coming on our compliance radio show.
Well, thank you. It was an honor.
So for more effective third-party compliance reviews, visit us at avivaspectrum.com. This is Sonia Luna, CEO and founder of Aviva Spectrum, signing off.